Hey, welcome everybody to Spirituality Adventures. We're glad you're tuning into this episode. We are a viewer and listener supported podcast, so we really appreciate you listening, watching on YouTube. We really encourage you to subscribe to whatever platform you're using. If you're on YouTube, hit that subscribe button, or if you're on Apple or however you listen to a podcast, be sure and subscribe. We greatly appreciate it. Also, make comments if you like it and share it if you like it. We really need people to make comments and share the episodes that you like. And then also, if you're not already a supporter, we really would encourage you to go to spiritualityadventures.com and you can pick a tier, and we have bonus content for every type of giver. This is a nonprofit, so they're tax-deductible donations, but we do provide bonus content for those who are supporters. So be a part of the team, help support Spirituality Adventures, and we're so glad you're tuning into this episode. All right, thanks everybody for tuning in to Spirituality Adventures. I am excited to do this interview today. I have never interviewed 4 people on Spirituality Adventures. I think we're getting close to our 200th episode. And I was honored to be asked by Tom Ord to contribute a chapter to this book, Preaching the Uncontrolling Love of God. And Nicole was the one who edited my sermon. Thank you, Nicole.
It was my pleasure.
Yeah. And this is the editorial team for the book. So we've got Jeff Wells, Vicki Randall, Nicole Torbitsky. Did I say that right?
Very good.
And Thomas J. Ord. All right. And this is an interesting book. First of all, let's give a big picture overview for people who might not even understand. I have plenty of listeners. I've interviewed Tom. I've interviewed a lot of people in the open and relational process theology world, but still my audience is definitely getting introduced to what this means and how important it's become to me. I'm new to this theology, even though I was aware of it for decades, but I would say I've only fully embraced it in the last few years as the way of my thinking and practice and all that kind of stuff. And I'm learning and growing. So I'm a newbie to the open and relational process world, but all of you have been in it for quite a long while. So let's I read John Cobb's introduction to this book, and I thought it was interesting that evidently this is one of the first attempts to do like a practical, like field church, local church type text for open and theology, and how to work open and theology, process theology into a local church context. Jeff, evidently you're the one that came up with this book idea. Is that right?
I did, yes.
So give us the big picture view of why you did this, and also give us a quick history of process theology. When did it start, and how is it gaining influence in the world? Yeah, I know that's a big question.
I am not going to take on that second part. I'm going to hand that over to Tom. But I can tell you how the book came about. So I started studying process theology in 2017. And I realized after a year or so in having conversations with other people in the Church of the Village that both the other pastor in the church, Alexis Lilly, who's also a contributor to the book, and our minister of worship arts, Jorge Lockwood, had both studied process theology and open and relational theology. Actually, Tom was one of Alexis's mentors when she was deconstructing and moving away from conservative evangelicalism. So we had a great team already assembled, and we decided in 2021, in August and September of 2021, to hold a worship series on process theology. And we invited a couple of well-known process theologians, Catherine Keller and John Tatamino, to be part of that series. And then each of us also preached in that series. And then right after that, we did a series on discipleship from a process perspective, and we got John Cobb to preach 3 Sundays in a row. So I came up, yeah, that was on Zoom, of course. We were still solely online at that point in 2021. But after all of that, I was very excited about the possibilities of moving in this direction as a congregation, and I thought, maybe we could just put together a little pamphlet, a little booklet with the sermons that were preached in the Church of the Village from this perspective. And then a couple months later, Tom preached as well online, and we could add that one in. And so then I mentioned that to John Cobb, and he said he would write a foreword for it, and then it kind of got put on the back burner because there was so much going on trying to create hybrid worship in the church and a lot of other things that were happening. So it didn't get revived until I went to the 50th anniversary conference of the Center for Process Studies, and I mentioned this idea to Mary Elizabeth Moore, and she said, "Well, Jeff, you can't wait. You have to do this book right now. We need this book." So then I went back to the Church of the Village, and I requested a leave of absence last summer for 9 weeks to start working on the book. And one of the first people who I contacted was Tom Ord, and I explained to him what my vision was for the book, and it had grown a little bit by that time because I had been in touch with a bunch of people on the process theology side and realized that there were a lot more people who could contribute to such a book. But Tom said, "Well, I really like this vision. I want to be your co-editor." So that was very exciting. And then he said, "Let's get a couple of other people to join us on the team." And so we can divide up the labor, and it's been a great process and was wonderful. I think everybody shares this feeling that it was wonderful working with one another on this project.
Excellent. Yeah. So you had like over 60 contributors to this book, right?
58 contributors and 73 individual submissions.
Wow.
There are 40 sermons and 33 essays, either essays about putting these ideas into practice in local congregations or about worship elements like prayer and songs and liturgical texts and even rituals. So how to put process or open and relational ideas into worship itself.
Okay. Well, let's do this then. I would like for each of you to introduce yourself. Just give us a quick, a short, simple bio, but then tell how you came to open relational process theology yourself. Like why did this, and in doing that, help our audience understand actually what open and relational process theology is as through your eyes, and have each of you do that. So we'll have each of you take a few minutes to introduce yourself and then tell why open relational process theology, what it means to you and why it's important to you. So who would like to go first?
Nicole would. I can see she's raised her hand.
Okay, I'll go first. Okay, so I was first introduced to process theology as an undergrad. So I took a course on Christianity at my undergraduate university, Truman State University in northeastern Missouri. And when we got to the unit, the reading on process theology, my poor professor was in way over his head. But I was hooked. Like just the little bit of reading that we did, I thought this starts to make sense of the way I understand God that works with me. And so I went to our library at the university, and I found a copy, the unedited version of Process and Reality. Mm. And I sat down in the stacks and I began to read the unedited version of Process and Reality, and I too was in over my head.
Man,
But it was great. So I already had that introduction. And then when I went to do my master's degree right out of my undergraduate work in divinity at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, I just so happened to have Susan Nelson as a professor. And she's no longer with us, but she is a process theologian herself. And so at that point, then I had a guide to walk me through process and reality. And it really did stick at that point. And here I am with a PhD in it and attempting to use it to inform my ministry.
Yeah, and I'm curious, when did Claremont become like the place for process theology? Just in the scope of, like, if you go back to Hartshorne and Whitehead, I'm assuming those are the two originators of process theology. Is that right?
Whitehead.
I was reading them at Baylor in 79, 80, 81, but I didn't convert then because I'd had this radical Southern Baptist conversion experience. But I read them and I thought, that's interesting. God's evolving like everything else. That was my 19, 20-year-old take on Whitehead and Hartshorne.
That's a reasonable take on it. So you all can correct me. Of course, Whitehead was working and developing this kind of stuff at Harvard in post-World War I. Hartshorne was at Chicago, right?
He was several places, but that's where he's most well known for being at. Yeah.
Okay. And then it was Cobb who ended up at Claremont, and that's how it started at Claremont. Yes.
Yeah, that's right. He and David Griffin started the Center for Process Studies in 1973.
Oh, wow. 73 there. Gee. Okay. All right. Cool. So we got a PhD from Claremont. That's pretty, wow. All right. There's a lot going on in that brain.
It was a good place to get my PhD. I highly recommend it.
Awesome. All right. Who wants to go next?
Go for it, Vicki.
Oh. I don't know that my story is that different. My background is in the Presbyterian Church, PCUSA. I've been a PCUSA pastor for 28 years, which is, of course, heavily steeped in our enemy, the Calvinists. So
that was my first thing when I saw your bio. Like, oh my God,
yeah. How does that work? I have an essay on that in the book.
I read it. I did read it.
So there is an essay on that, on how that works.
Yeah.
And fortunately, I'm in the Presbyterian denomination that is the least rigid about Calvinism. So lots more freedom. But that's my background. My background is actually in the evangelical wing, even of the Presbyterian Church. So all of my background is that I went to Fuller Seminary, which is also very reformed. So all of my training and education and early ministry experience is all in Reformed theology. And even how I processed even suffering in my own life was processed through that lens of Reformed theology. But then in, around the turn of the century, which always makes you sound so old when you say that, I started a Doctor of Ministry program at Azusa Pacific, which is also very evangelical, but it's Wesleyan and not Reformed. And that was where I started, obviously broadening my theological presumptions. And then in one of the courses, we were assigned the openness of God, which is from the open theism standpoint, is really when things began for open theists, or at least became very prominent. And that was just extremely transformative for me to read that. Then we started at APU. We started inviting. We held an AAR subgroup on open and process theology, met there for a conference with Greg Boyd as the keynote. So lots of exposure to open theism at APU. I taught at APU for 20 years. So that was really when things shifted for me, and the answers of open theism, which is the kissing cousin of process theology. Really so much better answer to the questions that we have. And fits so much better with our experience of the world and our experience of God. And even as an evangelical, I would call myself post-evangelical now, but at that time as an evangelical, experience is so important to us as evangelicals, and open theism fits that so much better. So it just was a system that helped me experience my faith in a much more consistent and coordinated way. And I do think that's what excites me about open and process theology, is when your faith makes sense of your experience of the world, when it makes sense of your experience of God, it just is so much more alive and so much more engaging and so much more powerful when it makes sense, when you're not having to have all these places where there's cognitive dissonance and you just have to write it off to mystery. Why these two things that don't fit together, and you just have to kind of make it a black box. A lot less black boxes with open and process theology, a lot less cognitive dissonance. So that's what excited me about it.
Thank you, Vicki. Tell, for our audience who's not deeply theological, what, in a brief couple sentences, what is open theism?
So open theism is much like process theology. And in fact, and Tom might want to answer this better than I do, but I would say the starting points are a little bit different. Process theology tends to start with philosophy and thinking sort of from a philosophical standpoint. Open theists tend to start with biblical theology. That's a broad overview, a broad generalization, because both are so diverse and the thinkers and workers, but they tend to start from different points. But they come to very similar conclusions, I would say. So there aren't a whole lot of foundational differences in where we end up. It's more how we got there.
Okay. All right. Tom, you go.
I think I'll jump on that defining thing first and then tell a little bit about my background.
Okay.
I think in general, open theism is known for its rejection of the idea that God foreknows the future. So a lot of theologies think that in some mysterious way, God knows with absolute certainty everything that's ever going to happen in the future. And open theism has been known as challenging that. Now, it happens to be the case that process theism also challenges that, but open theism probably has greater recognition for rejecting what's called exhaustive divine foreknowledge. What they share in common that sort of leads them to reject divine foreknowledge is an idea that some people might think is abstract, and that is God's relationship to time. Process and openness folks think that God moves through time moment by moment like we do, rather than being outside of it. And as abstract as that may sound, it has incredible implications for thinking about God's relationality, God's love, God's action, its prayer, et cetera, et cetera. So, jumping into my own story, I grew up in the evangelical community of the Church of the Nazarene, which is a Wesleyan holiness denomination. And when I was younger, the questions of grace, free will, and predestination were at the heart of my theological arguments with my friends. And I was on the free will side of that. But also the questions around evil were important to me. And I was trying to figure out a way that God wouldn't be culpable of either causing or allowing the genuine evils in the world. And I was wrestling with that. It was so tough. I took a course in philosophy of religion, and that course pulled the rug out from underneath in terms of my belief in God. The reasons I had for believing in God and for being an evangelist no longer made sense to me. And so I was an atheist or agnostic for a period of time. And I returned to belief in God based on my search for meaning, my trying to make sense of love. And I had a course my very last semester of college and I decided to write a paper on natural theology. So I went to my little holiness card catalog in those days and looked up natural theology, and there was this little book called A Natural Theology for Our Time by Charles Hartshorne. And I got that book out and I started reading it, and I do not claim to have understood what Charles Hartshorne was saying, but that was my first exposure to process theology. Went on to graduate school, took courses there, eventually ended up at Claremont because I really liked process theology. But being a part of the evangelical community, process theology was like, that was way over the edge. That was not even Christian. I sort of put the cross up, get thee behind me, Satan. Those process folks were way over. And yet I thought there was something right about it. And then these openness folks come in 1994, Clark Pinnock, Richard Rice, John Sanders, Bill Hasker, and David Basinger. And they write this book aimed at evangelicals like me, not going so far as process thought, in fact, trying very hard to distinguish themselves from process theology. But when I read their book, all I could see was all the similarities. And eventually decided, maybe there's a way to try to bring these two groups together under an open relational tag. So if folks hear that label thrown about, that's the attempt to try to say process and openness people have a lot in common. Yeah, there's some differences, but they have so much in common, we can work together.
All right. Thanks, Tom. Jeff, do you want to add anything to your story?
I'll say that, like you, Fred, I'm relatively new to this. I only started reading about process theology in 2017, 2018. And I didn't start out with either Hartshorne or Whitehead. I started out with Bob Mesley, who wrote a book called The Introduction to Process Theology. And John Cobb told me later that he thinks that Bob Mesley's book is actually the best introduction to process theology, better than his and David Ray Griffin's. And then I started, reading other things, but it wasn't really until after we already had our first process theology sermon series at Church of the Village that I did any academic study. That fall, I took process theology with John Tatamino at Union Theological Seminary, which was a tremendous class and an amazing. I don't know if you know anything about Union, it's got an amazingly diverse student body from all over the world, and from many different faiths. So it was amazing to be in this class with people from Myanmar and Kurdistan and China, and just incredible. And John is an amazing teacher. So that really drew me in. And then that same fall, I went out to Claremont and spent a week talking with John and meeting a lot of other people in the process community. So I got really sucked in very quickly, and then John recruited me to help found a new organization. He's always founding new organizations. So this was the Living Earth movement, because he's been for more than 50 years been very concerned about the ecological now catastrophe. I think he didn't call it that, and when he wrote about it in 1973, but he's really concerned about it, and thinks that the quickest way to address it is to get China and the U.S. to work together on it. So that's the thing he's focusing on right now. But what drew me in, what made me passionate, was the connection between process theology and process metaphysics and the vision that John has helped to promote of ecological civilization. So I think of myself as both an evangelist for process and open and relational theology, and also an evangelist for ecological civilization, because I think that's the critical issue that we have to address if we're even going to survive as a species, and maybe even life on the planet. So those are the things that are driving me these days.
Yeah, just small little things at stake.
Yeah.
Not big things. Yeah. So, all right. So maybe we'll start Nicole with this. So I think one of the things, like most Christians, and in my view, have, whether they've studied theology or not, whether they've even read the Bible or not, if they believe in God and they call themselves a Christian or even just a theist, most people, I think, have just absorbed classical theism. Okay. So for our lay people who might be listening, I would like each of you to give me your take on why you're not a classical theist, and why is that important to you, both intellectually and experientially, emotionally. Okay, because I think that gets at the nub of some of the ways where we rethink, the attributes of God through an open and relational and processed lens. So Nicole, why don't you start? Yeah.
Well, Whitehead says that all philosophy is a footnote to Plato. And this is and this is kind of the beginning of what we consider classical theology.
Yeah.
And what Plato and particularly the medieval scholastic philosophers pick up is this real separation between God and the world. So much so that when you get to, say, Aquinas, it's really difficult for him to explain how God can even interact with the world, because God is so very separate. And so this has left us with a picture of God as distant and controlling, but almost more like Zeus than like the picture of who God is that we get through Jesus Christ in the Gospels. So, and that's where I think a lot of the cognitive dissonance comes from, to people who are maybe deconstructing their Christianity today, or people who have run up to some of those things that don't quite make sense and they just decide they're not going to think about it anymore. Because a lot of the ways that God gets talked about today in what we might consider to be classical theological terms look a lot like pagan gods. And that causes problems. Well, why didn't Zeus throw that thunderbolt for me when I asked? And it helps us, and we fall into these problems of evil and time, as Tom talked about, the importance of prayer and how prayer can be anything except for just us talking to ourselves. When we move into an open and relational way of thinking about God, we have a God who is responsive. A God who doesn't have everything all planned out since before the beginning of time, because God stands outside of the world. We have a God who is actually actively involved in the creation of the world as it's progressing. And this helps us have a relationship. So this is where the relational part comes from, right? We have a relationship with God, because God can be relational instead of kind of platonic or Thomistic, right outside of everything in existence. I'm sure I missed a whole lot. I defer to my far wiser counterparts on how to get into the differences between classical and process or open and relational theology.
Thank you. Good, Nicole. I mean, let's go with Vicky now.
Oh gosh, I can't think of anything you left out, really. Yeah. Do you want me to go back to the question just of
the classic?
Of why? Yeah.
Most people listening to this podcast are in the classical theist camp, right?
Yeah. And it's kind of the air we breathe.
Even think of it that deeply. They just absorbed it, right? And then so now we're trying to, for all these different reasons, we're trying to come up with a God that works with science and evolution and experience and all these different things, so. Yeah,
again, I think I pretty much said it all before. Just it fits so much better with our experience of the world. It fits better with scripture for those of us with an evangelical background. It really fits scripture better. As Nicole said, it fits the picture of Jesus that we see in scripture better. So it just functionally works better. And there's just, it just is so different when your faith works like that, when it connects with your experience of the world. It just promotes a passion and an engagement. And then you can start to see how that gets played out in different places. And the fruit of the two different systems. I think, as long as we're bashing on Calvinism, let me just say, I think what we're seeing right now is the fruit of the kind of neo-reformed movement when even denominations that didn't used to be reformed, became reformed, and that became the default, as you're saying, that everybody sort of assumes. And that picture of God as controlling, as dictating the future, gets lived out, I think, in our systems, in our families, in our churches, in our government, in our politics. Greg Boyd, who I quote a lot, and I quote this one line in particular quite a lot. Greg Boyd says, "The greatest predictor of the quality of your life is the view that you have of Jesus." And if your view of God and Jesus is of controlling and
Judging,
dictating, what is going to happen, that's what you're going to live out in your systems. And I think that's what we're seeing right now in politics with the rise of authoritarianism. I really think that's connected to the rise of Reformed theology. It's what we're seeing in our churches when you have these ecclesiastical structures that are very hierarchical, and people are not allowed to question their pastor. It's what we see in family systems when complementarian theology, where the husband is the boss. All of those systems, I think, follow from that view of God as controlling and dictating. Whereas this view of God that Nicole spoke of so beautifully, of a God that is relational, that's going through life with us, that's partnering with us, that gives us agency and freedom, that's just a much different view of the world that's going to affect how that's lived out in politics, in ecclesiastical circles, in families. It just is a different way of life.
Thank you. Good. Tom?
They've said so many good things. I think I'm going to come at this from a different angle. Just about every person I know who believes in God would say God is perfect. But the way classical theism understands perfection is much different than the way open relational process people understand perfection. A classical person would say God is perfect, so God is unchanging and unaffected by anything that happens on earth. Whereas an open and relational person would say, no, God's perfection is that God is actually empathetic, is actually in relationship, can have real compassion because God is affected by what's going on. The classical person would say God is God's will, perfection is God's will is always done, which means that God is in charge, either in a controlling way or at least in a way that God could control. Where people in the open and relational camp want to say, perfection isn't about control. Perfection is about cooperation, collaboration, working together in kind of a synergy. The classical theist would often say, especially Augustine, God's perfection, God is so perfect that God only wants to think about and be concerned about what is the best. And the best is God's self. So to put it in contemporary words, God is the ultimate narcissist because God is only thinking about God's self. Whereas the open and relational folks say, no, God is altruistic and egoistic. God is concerned about us and God's own welfare. And that's a healthy way to live for us. In fact, perfection in the classical model really can't be imitated by creatures. We can't fulfill the Apostle Paul's injunction to imitate God as dearly beloved children and live a life of love like Jesus loved us. But an open and relational perspective, because God's love and creature love are similar, we can actually imitate the God of love.
Excellent. I like that. All right. How about you, Jeff?
So I had the experience, which I have heard from many other pastors who have ventured into relational theology, open and relational theology, or process theology, of feeling like the things that I was learning explained and provided a better foundation for things that I was already thinking and talking to my congregations about. And I especially think that that's true of the issue of whether God sort of controls and has a plan for each of our lives, and related to that, the issue of evil, of pain and suffering, and God's role in that. So I remember preaching a sermon at the church that I served before I got appointed to the Church of the Village. I think this was 2014. That was titled, "Does God Have a Plan?" ? And my answer was no, but I had only a very small grasp and understanding of what was behind my answer. Whereas after I got into process theology, I preached it again. I think it was in 2023, with a much fuller and deeper understanding. And I think so I would say that at the Church of the Village, I personally and the congregation resonated with two things the most. One, that God is not controlling, and God can't simply come in and resolve all of our issues or fix all of suffering and evil in the world. And that helps because it deals with the problem of theodicy. And the other part that is I think so important, and people feel at a deep emotional level, is the idea that God is not distant and intervening occasionally in our lives, but that God is accompanying us and leading us and inspiring us and beckoning us, calling us every moment of every day, and not just us, but the whole universe. And so that idea, I feel, gave me a much more constant sense of God's presence in my life, and helped me to listen better. And I've heard that same thing. I've said that to the congregation too, and I've heard that repeated back to me from members of my congregation. And I think that's so important. I mean, of course, the fact that therefore we're in relationship with God, and God actually changes. We have an impact on God because of the decisions that we make. That too, I think, is kind of mind-blowing for people once they understand that reality.
Excellent. Well, I want y'all to give me some advice. And Tom and Nicole have to jump off a little earlier than Vicky and Jeff. So I'm going to start with Nicole and Tom, and then we'll go to Jeff and Vicky. But so here, my evolution, I got saved at a Southern Baptist youth camp. I was smoking weed at 14, good athlete, smart student, but wanted everybody to get high because I thought the whole world would be better and everybody would chill out, and thought even my mom and dad would be a lot more chill if they'd smoke some weed. And so I get saved at a Southern Baptist youth camp. I get discipled by Southern Baptists. Now I'm trying to lead all my friends to Christ. I go to Baylor. I study with very liberal professors who love Tillich and Bultmann, but I was this newly saved kid. And so I kind of gravitated toward what ultimately became like an N.T. Wright type person. And I remember, like, I wasn't a Calvinist because I just couldn't buy into some of that stuff, even like at Baylor when I was 18, 19, 20, 21. I also would have moved toward a more free will Arminian defense for evil, and so held on to classic theism my whole life until the last few years, right? I wasn't a cessationist, so I got into the charismatic. I would have called myself charismatic light. I ended up in the Vineyard movement, started a Vineyard church. We had this really hefty theology of the already not yet part of the kingdom coming from George Eldon Ladd, and we put the whole supernatural work of God in that lens. We prayed for the sick. I've prayed for thousands of sick people all over the world. I always thought, man, I must not have the gift of healing because not very many of them got healed, but every now and then somebody would get healed and it would be verifiable. And it was I could tell you some pretty amazing stories that I've seen, through healing prayer and just the moving of the Spirit and sort of that Pentecostal world. And so, and then at the same time, I've done funerals for babies that died that I prayed for. And I've done funerals for people who committed suicide. And I've done funerals for murders and gang murders. And I've done I did my best to have a hefty theology of suffering, which even if God doesn't heal, God does meet us and work through suffering. I didn't want to blame it on God, but certainly God allows things, even evil, out of this free will mindset that I had. But then when I fell apart myself and had my own personal meltdown in 2019, I literally felt like an atheist because it felt like God had because of the way I'd thought about God, it felt like God himself or herself had set me up for my own downfall. And I was just like, F that God. I just couldn't hold on to that. So here my own theology that I had comforted so many thousands of people with isn't working for me. And then I feel shame about that. But then I questioned everything I ever believed, and to hang on to God, the only way I could hang on was this whole process thing. That's the only way that kept me hanging on to a concept of God that I could work with. And then I start pastoring again a year and 3 months ago after taking like a 4-year break. Now I find myself preaching because I preached so many years, and I'll say things, because I'm an extemporaneous preacher. I'll say things I like, it'll come out of my mouth, and then I keep preaching. But I back up and I go, crap, I don't think I believe that anymore. I go to the Persuade conference and I'm thinking, holy crap, I've got to think through ecclesiastical structures. I've got to think through feminist theology. I got to think through colonial deconstruction. I got to think, like my whole world. Like if I read, when I read Colby's book, Jesus and John Wayne, that's how I was raised. That's my world. And then I'm just thinking I just was trying to deconstruct God. Now I've got to deconstruct all the models that I've ever worked with my whole life. Even though my vineyard, I had women pastors. We had queer people in our congregation from day one for 30 years. We were fairly grace-based, sort of progressive evangelical, I would guess. But I was always moving more progressive throughout my whole pastoral career, right? But then I had this major meltdown. Now I'm trying to rethink everything and pastor again. I'm pastoring a little open and affirming church. All my former evangelical friends are praying for my salvation again now. I keep losing followers who listen to stuff like this. And they're like, oh man, Fred needs to get saved again, dang it. So I'm still trying to evolve and move into this world that I'm loving everything I think through, but help me out, folks. I'm 63 trying to all of a sudden rethink Fred and rebuild myself. And it's it affects everything, including even the way I think about politics and stuff like that. Right. It's just been a complete, just raise it to the ground and then try to rebuild it through this lens of open relational process theology. The thinking part of me loves it, but the friendships and the people that don't understand where I'm going and the losses of, oh man, I can't tell you how many people and friends and colleagues and the whole move. I'd built the third largest vineyard church in the world probably, and so you can just imagine some of the upheaval that I've gone through. How do I keep navigating this? I keep trying to hang out with you guys and try to do in church in a whole new way with whole new ecclesiastical thinkings and structures, and trying to preach in ways that are congruent with uncontrolling love of God. How do I pray for the sick? How do I, I did so many things, so many ways. And then now I'm trying to rethink those ways. How can I still keep, you understand what I'm asking. So give me some advice. Give me your advice for Fred. We'll start with you, Nicole. Help me out.
Well, so let me start with a book recommendation. and this might not be for all of your listeners, but it's definitely for you. There's a book out there by Marjorie Suhaki. I know. I thought I had a bad last name. God bless Marjorie. So her name is Marjorie Suhaki, and she wrote this wonderful, relatively slim volume called God, Christ, Church.
Okay.
And she does a really good job helping theological types understand a little bit more about not just how God works, but how Christ fits into that, and then how church fits into that.
Okay.
And I recommend it.
Excellent.
And the readers can listen, can read it. Your listeners can read it too, and then you all can do a book study on it.
Yeah, and maybe I can get her on my podcast and talk about it.
Yeah, you might still. Yeah, she occasionally will show up and do these kinds of things.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. I've got it written down. Tom, give me some advice. Of course, Tom's been giving me some advice for a while now, but anyway.
Well, I think what you describe is the description a lot of people have of their life. Obviously, details differ, but more than 30 million people in the last 15 years, 30 million Americans have gone from being affiliated with a religion to being affiliated with no religion. And again, every story is unique, but I think part of what open relational process folks have to offer someone like you is acknowledgement that we all are in process, that in the past, you were rewarded for having settled on the fixed truths, that once you had them, you could know them with certainty and proclaim them to the world. And now you've discovered those things aren't so true, and you're trying to figure out where to go. It's really tempting to think you can find another pile of fixed truths that you're finally going to get it right. But I think one of the lessons of process theology, open relational, is that we are always on the move. It's not that we don't have anything that we look to as being more plausible than not, so it's not like absolute chaos, but we're always in transition, looking and trying to respond to the spirit of love as best we know how, never absolutely certain, always on the way, to use the old phrase. And that's okay, because that's the way God is too. God is a spirit on the move. God is seeking new and exciting and more truthful ways of luring you and all of reality into something better. And I think I like the way you said your mind is in one place, but I don't know how you said it, but maybe your body or your emotions or something is in another. Mm-hmm. And I think that's so true for many people. Intellectually, they can work something through, but they've had a history of living with certain habits and patterns and communities and relationships, mm-hmm. and that just doesn't disappear overnight. Mm-hmm. So my encouragement would be keep working at the head stuff and bringing head and heart together, because I think it can happen.
Mm. Yeah, people like certainty.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
They want to, I like it. Mm-hmm. And one of my phrases for my last 5 years has been less certain, more open. Mm-hmm. Just beautiful. A simple little thing, but like to be okay with uncertainty but that's challenging. Like,
definitely.
Kind of angry that the God that I'd believed in for the last 60 years wasn't working. Mm-hmm. Like, now I got to believe in a God who can't do anything. That's not true, but that's how it felt.
It feels like that. Yeah.
I love your little deal in your omnipotent book, Tom, on your little formula of what God can do. All right. Anyway. All right. So thank you. By the way, before Tom and Nicole lead, I was going to ask you, what did you learn and how did you become in the process of editing this book? Mm-hmm. So Nicole,
Nicole, I wasn't
real fast.
Yeah, I wasn't actually an editor, so I'll go ahead and leave, and Nicole can give you your answer. Okay. I mean, I was an editor in the formal sense, but not like the nuts and bolts like they all were. So,
what did you learn in the process, Tom? How did you become?
Well, I learned that a lot of people think and preach open relational process thought, but haven't really thought through the details of why they do it that way. It's kind of, I think a lot of people who wrote for this book are open and relational intuitively. And like you said earlier, they've kind of got the mental things checked off. But this book became an exercise for them to think more carefully about their sermonizing from that perspective.
Okay. All right, cool. Thank you.
All right. See you guys.
Yeah. Take care, Tom. Nicole, what did you learn through the process of editing this book?
Nobody knows how to use a comma. That's what I learned. It's just a wild west, just a free for all for commas out there.
Well, it's changed from the time I started at Baylor in 79, 80, 81, 82 to now. It's like, I don't know what to do with commas anymore.
It's true. It's true. So most of my editing was, hey, you just need to move some commas around. And most of what I read was really very theologically sound, and I appreciated all of it. One of the things that I came away from after reading all of the articles that I read is that there's a real hunger out there for understanding God as not controlling. What I think that we need to do after we do our music book, Jeff, our hymnal,
yes,
move on to like
do worship songs, right?
we do.
We absolutely do. Yeah.
So after we do the hymnal, is to move away from theology and into like Christology or pneumatology, right? And in ecclesiology. So it's time to move into how, given an uncontrolling God, how do we understand the rest of Christian life, right? And how do we, as Christians who believe in a relational God, claim that, right? Because as you said, Fred, your friends are like, well, I'm praying for you because you're not really even Christian anymore. Wrong, right? Not only are we Christian, we're great at it because we're following Christ's example. And I think so one of the great takeaways from this is, wow, this was amazing. And I'm so glad we did it. And there's so much more we can do.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you, Nicole. If you need to hop off, you're welcome to. I know you've got a meeting.
I'm going to. I'm sad to go because it was a pleasure talking with you. And I love hanging out with my fellow editors. And it was good to see you all again.
Awesome.
Yep. Great to see you too.
Thank you, Nicole.
Bye.
All right. So everybody, we still got Vicki and Jeff with us. Vicki, give me some advice. Give me some advice as I reemerge and rebuild my whole world, landscape, everything. What do you?
Oh gosh, your story is so much like my story. I'm 67, so maybe I'm 4 years ahead of you. I don't know, but yeah, it's a very familiar story. I'm not coming from quite the heights that you are in terms of the third largest vineyard. I'm, coming from much more humble pastoral experiences, but definitely the church that I'm pastoring now is by far the smallest.
Me
and
too.
so, yeah,
right. Yeah. The church pastoring now is quite small. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. And mine is the same. It's a very small, open and affirming church, tiny church. I think some call it micro church, but, and I think part of that, and part of even just the whole way we navigate this, is recognizing that there is so much disruption in the church space right now. Tom alluded to that. And the way that the place that church will have in society, the way we understand church, what church is going to look like, is in disruption. So we're just living through this disruptive time. My kids are in totally different fields, and they're experiencing that in their fields where they'll, both of them spent 4 years studying something in college and graduated, and, that's evaporated, so there's just a lot of disruption right now, and that does feel chaotic and anxiety producing. So some of it is just taking a deep breath and normalizing anxiety a little bit. And that's, when we talk about how do we teach this to our congregations, how do we teach open and relational theology to our congregation, it's going to be anxiety producing for them. And when they come to church, and church is small, so much smaller than it was when we were growing up in the 70s, and it's struggling more than it was in the 70s. Part of it is just normalizing that this is a time of disruption. The church has been through periods of disruption at various times in our history. And I believe we always came out better and stronger for it. We always came out with a better view of God, a better way to do church, a better way to be together. And we're in that period now where we don't know what it's going to look like. We don't know where it's going. We're evolving, and God is with us in time as we're evolving and figuring out, what does church in this new millennia look like? And it's not going to look like the church of our childhood. It's not going to look like even what we were trained for, those of us in our 60s. We weren't trained for this. So it is, so just, I think, acknowledging the anxiety and trusting that God is with us in this, and it's going to be good. It's going to be good. I think we're moving toward a more honest faith, a more inclusive faith, obviously, and a more, a more authentic faith that's just really lived out. So I think that's my humble advice, and let's all be our own support group, and get on a Zoom call once a week about how rough it is to exist in this space. But
Sure.
yeah.
Thank you for that. Hey, by the way, I did a D-Min at Fuller. I studied with Peter Wagner, actually.
Oh yeah.
And Chuck Van Ingen too. I studied with him. But the one book that I did like that Richard Mouw wrote was He Shines in All That's Fair. I don't know if you've ever read that.
I haven't.
But it's his theology of common grace. And when I read it, I thought, well, crap, common grace is the only kind of grace there is. I mean, it was thinking through a Calvinist lens of the differences of saving grace and common grace. But when he dove into common grace, it was like, to me, it was almost a lot like incarnational theology.
Yeah.
And so anyway, that's just a FYI. But, Richard Mouw was the president of Fuller for several years. I don't know who's there now, but when I graduated, he was still president. But anyway, and by the way, too, when I was working on a PhD with the Hebrew Bible, the chapter that Abraham Joshua Heschel wrote in his book Prophets called The Philosophy of Pathos, and he dives into the Greek philosophers and their nervousness of emotion and their ideals of these perfectionistic ideals. That really, and that was 10 years ago, that
Heschel is great.
That got me going, probably pushing me toward the process route, like deconstructing classical theism through the eyes of Abraham Joshua Heschel. But Jeff, what about you? What advice would you give me you've gone through it, sounds like, as well. Were you concerned with me before you started reading Process, or were you, it sounds like you're probably a little more liberal than I was.
I was never conservative.
Okay.
No. I had a very different kind of deconstruction. I dropped out of my Methodist youth group when I was 16. And by the time I got to college, I thought of myself as a socialist. So I was away from the church for 20 years. And in 1996, I left an organization, a left-wing organization I was part of, and had, after a couple of years, had a very profound spiritual reawakening. And somebody recommended this church in Manhattan where I was living, just as a place to explore these feelings. So I didn't even think of myself as a Christian at that point or a follower of Jesus. I didn't know what I was, but I needed some place to where I could talk to people about it.
Hmm.
And so I ended up in that church and loved the community and got very involved. And I joined, even though I didn't know if I believed the vows of membership that I was agreeing to. But I joined sort of on faith, and that somehow this would develop, and it did. And then within about another year, I was meditating one day and felt a call to preach. I literally felt like I heard that word, not heard orally, but heard in my head the word preach, and had the most profound sense that this was coming from outside of myself. It wasn't something that I sort of came up with myself.
Mm-hmm.
And so then I went off to seminary, and but I would say that I've been so I went into ordained ministry with a background in left-wing activism and great passion for social justice and LGBT inclusion and all of that, and feminism. And so that's been a part of my ministry for the whole 18 and a half years I've been doing this. In the first church I was in, it was very divided. So it spanned the whole range from Tea Party members to quite liberal members of the congregation. And that was a very tremendous learning experience for me, as I was sort of evolving in my understanding of what it meant to be a progressive Christian and how could I help this congregation to evolve as well. And it took 10 years, but ultimately, the month before I got appointed or left to take over at the Church of the Village, they took a vote to become fully inclusive of LGBT folks, which was a big deal for that congregation, and without losing a lot of members. I think two or three people left the congregation, but not a lot. Even though some people didn't like the decision, they felt like this is their church and they weren't going to leave, and this wasn't going to drive them out. So that was a tremendous learning experience, and helped me to understand that not only was I always evolving, but the church is always evolving. So I would say in response to your question, so I'm 66 years old. So we're all in the same basic generation.
Yes.
And with a fair amount of experience as church pastors. I would say be open to the changes that we know are going to happen. Be patient with yourself, and then for the people that you're trying to lead, trying to help along this pathway that we're on, this very uncertain pathway. Everything in the world seems uncertain these days, right? And I think, to your point, that people like certainty because they don't want to have to face the difficulties and the scariness of what's happening in the world or in their own lives. I think that's a big part of what's behind Christian nationalism, or conservative evangelicalism in general, but especially Christian nationalism. It's like, I have to have something to hold on to, even if it's white supremacy and racism. But I think that process and open and relational theology really help us with that, because they both say everything is open. The future is open. We don't know it. God doesn't know it. But God is there with us in every moment, trying to lead us in the best directions possible, right? To make the best decisions possible, not just as individuals, but together as communities in our relationships with one another. God's in all of those relationships, helping us try to figure out our way forward amidst very serious challenges for the whole world. And it also says we ought to be open to the wisdom of other faith traditions, of other religions. And I think that if we're going to survive as a species, we're going to have to move in that direction, and try to follow Jesus's teaching to love one another and love our enemies as ourselves, right? To love our enemies and those who persecute us. So that, in terms of the things that I feel certain about, that's what I hold on to most, is the teachings of Jesus, especially love your neighbor and love your enemy.
Yeah. Me too.
But if you don't mind, I was reading a blog by Jonathan Foster this morning, and he has these two sentences which I think speak to this in a small way. Okay. He says, "Love's ability to control is limited, and yet love's ability to persist is unlimited."
Ooh,
I love that.
Nice line.
If love never leaves us, then there is always hope.
Ooh.
Thank you for that.
There you go. There's your advice.
Jonathan's here.
And in terms of books, I would say preaching the uncontrolling love of God is not just for preachers. It's not just for clergy. It's for everybody.
Yes.
Any member of a Christian community could benefit from reading essays and sermons in this book.
I agree.
Because I think that they're written at a very accessible level, and a lot of them are talking about people's own experience of evolving and changing. One of the ones that I really appreciate is Russ Dean's essay, which he called "I Invented Process Theology."
That was a fun one.
because he had been preaching a lot of ideas that are aligned with process theology for a long time. He just didn't know that that's what he was doing.
Yeah. That's cool. Jonathan and I live in Kansas City, and we've met just in the last year or so, and I'm interviewing him in a couple of weeks. Yeah. And I said, well, you got to mail me your signed copies of your book. Which book did you read that quote out of? I'm curious. Where did that quote? It's in a blog.
This is actually from a blog that he put out today.
Okay. Check that out then.
So, but the only book that I've read cover to cover of his is Indigo, The Color of Grief.
Okay.
Which is a tremendous volume. It's incredible. And the things that he's been through and the way that he writes so poetically about grief, and from such a deep place within his soul. It's just amazing. I love his writing.
Excellent. And what did you?
He's also a contributor to the book for your listeners.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
He wrote a wonderful essay called "Deep Witness," which is about the God's constant presence in our lives. Yeah,
he had recommended a book on that to me on incarnational theology by I'm trying to remember, God Will Be All in All by Anna Case Winters.
Oh yeah,
that one. Anyway,
I've not read it, but I know of her.
I guess that's a really vision of panentheism through the incarnational lens kind of a thing. So anyway, and what did you learn through the process, Jeff, of editing this book?
I think the biggest thing that I learned, the biggest surprise for me, was how many people are doing this. That we were relatively easily able to accumulate, essays and sermons from 68 contributors, and I know there are a lot more people doing it. And then to have somebody like Brian McLaren, who was one of the endorsers of the book, say there are tens of thousands, and I think there are probably hundreds of thousands of congregations across North America in particular that could benefit from this, that would be open to this kind of book. And I said in another podcast recently, imagine if there were 100,000 congregations across the United States that were promoting these ideas, what an impact that could have.
Yeah.
The number of people who would be influenced by that.
Yeah.
Million.
I mean, doubling down on the love of God and trying to become consistent with an uncontrolling vision of the love of God through not only theology, but practice and community life and ecclesiology and politics and on and on and on. Like, whew. Yeah, that's where I could become an evangelist again.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yes. And
I get out on the streets, start sending out, my tracks that I made up, So anyway.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to do that online, mostly in social media.
Yeah.
But I'm planning on retiring before too many years, and that is what I would like to do in my retirement, is to be a speaker and consultant with churches and do a lot more writing. Because I think that what we've done with this book, as Nicole said, this is just the tip of the iceberg of what we need to do. But I think that it could be so important. Just like I think process metaphysics is a requirement. We have to spread the good news of process metaphysics if we're going to change the world enough that we can live in harmony as a species with the rest of nature. I think that that's true of process theology. That if we're gonna come up with and this, of course, it's not only a Christian theological perspective. Open and relational and process theology work across every religion I can think of. I think if we can attract people to these ideas, it really could transform the world.
I love that vision. Hey, by the way, a friend of mine who is on my spirituality adventure board lives in New York. I think I mentioned him to you when I was in person, Rod Colburn, and I think he's hosting. I met Jackie Lewis a month ago or so in New York, and I'm on Friday night, June 7th. Brian and Jackie are doing an event together that Rod is hosting in New York. I'm hoping to be there. I'm not 100% sure, but I want to get you an invite to that.
Yeah. Send me the information about that. I'd love to be part of that.
So Vicki, I'm with all the people, I've forgotten where I left off with you last. Help you gave me a little bit of advice, right?
Yeah.
Okay. How about, what did you learn through? Did you share that already? What you learned through?
No. Okay. I think what I learned was primarily what Tom said, the breadth of how many people are doing this and the diversity and the connections. I've mostly been in the open space and reading and listening and talking with other open theologians and people that are reading Greg Boyd and, Hasker and Sanders and the people that specifically identify as open. So this has given me a much broader exposure to the process side, and again, how closely we are working in the same ways. So both the unity and the diversity of it, how many different people in so many different settings and different perspectives, but also how we are discovering the same things about God together. So I think that would be what I got most out of it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's been fascinating for me. In 2019, when I was feeling like an atheist and in my darkest, really probably didn't want to live. I was just so humiliated by my own behavior. I'd failed my own standards, right? And it was publicized, like my worst things that I did over a 1-year period of time were on the front page of the Kansas City Star. And I was just in this dark place. And a friend of mine, literally from the National Prayer Breakfast of all sources.
Oh, wow.
The Richard Rohr book, Falling Upward.
Yeah.
And I read that, and that's what kind of got my faith off the ventilator. I started reading started reading everything Richard Rohr wrote, and then I started reading all of Richard Rohr's footnote references, right?
Oh, wow.
And it just started, and then of course that led me right into the panentheism and process, and so then I just started reading again. I just ran across Tripp's Homebrewed Christianity 2 years ago. I had never even heard of Tripp, and then I find this deal, and I just did an interview with him last Thursday. It'll come out tomorrow and I really just focused on the book that they just put out called God After Deconstruction. But it's been a fascinating world to me I've bumped into people from every Christian tradition. I've been in an interfaith group for the last 5 years that we started up during COVID with rabbis and Buddhists and every kind of Christian and that kind of thing here in Kansas City. But the openness this is definitely, it's a bigger movement than I even realized, I guess is maybe a way to say it. And I think that's, both of you are pointing to that. So it does give me a lot of hope. Mm-hmm. It does give me a lot of hope that that more people grasping onto the uncontrolling love of God and working that through all of the ways they do family life, the way they do church life, the way they think about the world and the interaction of God with the world, and the way they think about politics, and the way they think about, Jeff, your sermon on systematized sin, versus just individual sin, that collective.
Yeah.
The Walter Wink, the powers, and all that kind of stuff. It's hopeful for me. So even in my post-traumatic growth, it's given me at least hope. Okay, for the rest of my life that I have here on this planet, if I can contribute to a more holistic vision of an uncontrolling love of God, then I can give myself to that. Because I was thinking, even if there's no God, this is really, I boiled it down in my darkest moment. Even if there's no God, I still know there's love. Yeah. I've experienced it. I still know there's beauty. I've seen it. Even if I don't understand the philosophy as aesthetics, there is beauty. I've experienced it. There's generativity and generosity and creativity. I've experienced it, and I just kind of boiled it down to these things that I know exist. I've experienced them, and those are the things that I want to give myself to. Yeah. I don't want to be bitter the rest of my life. I want to forgive. I want to forgive myself. I want to forgive other people. I want to make peace. I want to bring justice into the world. I just boiled it down to those basic foundations, and then the theology that started working for me was this theology, so. Yeah, well, thank you so much for being on Spirituality Adventures. Thanks for taking time out of your schedule. We got California and New York left with us, and I'm in Kansas City. So see, it's covering
the nation,
covering the continent, right? Yeah. So folks, like Jeff said, this is a book that's very readable. It's not a deep academic read. It's for pastors. It's for people that serve in the church. It's for Christians of all stripes. And you will find some very helpful, beneficial content here. So thank you so much for the time that you've spent today. Thank you for your work in ministry. Thanks for bringing this book into existence. And I'm grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred.
Thank you.
I'm really glad that we got to connect at the Persuade Preaching Conference and made this happen.
Yes. Thanks everybody for tuning in to Spirituality Adventures, and we'll see you next time. Take care. Hey, you made it to the end. Thanks for listening all the way through on this episode. By the way, if you're not already a supporter, go to spiritualityadventures.com, sign up for one of our monthly supports, and you will receive our bonus content. You'll receive lots of interesting information about our guests. Many of our musicians will do special bonus songs and record a song. So I want to encourage you to do that. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Be sure and subscribe. Be sure and share any of the episodes that you like. And be sure and make comments if you like them as well. This helps us get Spirituality Adventures out there to more listeners, more watchers. So whatever platform you're using, subscribe, like, share, make comments, and go to our website, sign up for our team, and be a part of the team support. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.